So this is part 2 of the lecture for Unit 2.1, where we'll talk about chemical bonds and chemical properties and drawing chemical structures. So this table shows the Bohr model of an atom, which we talked about earlier. And this isn't really an accurate representation of what atoms are really like, but it's a useful representation, it's a useful model for understanding how electrons behave and how they play a role in making chemical bonds. So in the Bohr model we have the nucleus, and then surrounding the nucleus are these rings where the electrons hang out. And in the Bohr model, atoms like to have a specific number of electrons in each one of those rings. In the innermost ring, which is period 1, that can fit up to 2 electrons. So 2 electrons in that outer ring. Then in the next ring out, which is shown here, the second ring, that can fit 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in that next shell. Right? And so that is the maximum number of electrons in that shell. And then in each one of the next shells, which we won't talk about a whole lot, but those also fit 8. And so atoms like to have 8 electrons in those outer shell. That's when they're most stable. Since they're most stable when they have that outer shell filled, they're least stable when they just need to gain or get rid of 1 electron to have a full shell. Right? And so hydrogen is not very stable with 1 electron, and it's very stable when there are 2 electrons in the outer shell. Hydrogen is a small atom, forms a gas, right? It's very chemically reactive because it has 1 electron in the outer shell and it wants 2. Helium is also a very small atom. It's also a gas. It's very light. Helium is a very stable molecule because it has that outer electron full of those 2 nice electrons. Atoms at the beginning of the period, things like lithium that has 1 electron in that outer shell and it wants 8. Things like fluorine, which has 7 in that outer shell and it wants 8. Those are very chemically reactive. Right? Carbon is an interesting one because it is right in the middle of the period. Its atomic number is 6, and so it has 6 electrons and 6 protons. It's got 2 in the inner shell, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 8 in that outer shell. It's got that outer shell half full. Right? So because carbon can either gain or lose 4 electrons to have a full outer shell, carbon likes to form bonds with lots of things. It's a reasonably stable element because it's right in the middle, right? But it's good at forming bonds. So how do these bonds work? Covalent bonds are when atoms share electrons between 2 different atoms. Right? And so since atoms like to have that full outer electron shell, since hydrogen has just 1 electron here, oxygen has 6 out of 8 in that outer electron shell. If oxygen is able to gain 2 electrons, it's got a full shell. If hydrogen is able to gain 1 electron, it's got a full shell. And so what happens is that hydrogen shares 1 of its electrons with oxygen and shares 1 of those oxygen electrons. And oxygen does that same thing with another hydrogen. And that forms 2 covalent bonds between hydrogen, 2 hydrogens and oxygen, forms this molecule, H2O, that we also call water. There can be situations where 2 electrons are shared between the same 2 atoms. And so here we have oxygen that's sharing 2 electrons between those 2 atoms, forming molecular oxygen, or O2, and so this is the molecule that floats around in our atmosphere. Ionic bonds are bonds that occur between atoms with opposite charge. Since those electrons are just associated with that electron shell, they can be lost in certain situations. So certain atoms can lose or gain electrons. Sodium is one such atom. It can lose an electron, and because those electrons are negatively charged, when it loses an electron, it's still got that proton, and so it becomes positively charged. Chlorine is an atom that can gain electrons, right? And when it gains an electron, it gains that negative charge, and so it has a net negative charge. You can see over here we got positive sodium, negative chlorine. With charge, opposites attract. And so these two atoms can form a ionic bond, which forms a compound called NaCl, which we also call table salt. So hydrogen bonds are one of the most important bonds for biological systems. So hydrogen bonds are a little bit different. So hydrogen bonds are weak. They're weak interactions. They don't make up individual molecules. They happen between molecules. And so the hydrogen bonds in this figure are represented by dashed lines instead of the solid lines that represent covalent bonds. So hydrogen bonds are interactions between hydrogen and an electronegative atom like oxygen or nitrogen. There are two important parts of a hydrogen bond. There's a hydrogen bond donor and a hydrogen bond acceptor. The hydrogen bond donor is an electronegative atom that has a hydrogen to give. So like this nitrogen with the hydrogen attached to it here. Hydrogen bond acceptor is an electronegative atom without a hydrogen, like this nitrogen here. And a donor and acceptor can form a hydrogen bond pair. Here we see a hydrogen bond donor with that hydrogen to give. And here we see an oxygen hydrogen bond acceptor. Hydrogen bonds are really important in proteins and nucleic acids, like these DNA nucleotides here. They form a lot of important biological interactions between molecules. So, in your notes, arrange the following types of bonds in the order from the strongest to the weakest: hydrogen, ionic, and covalent. Which one is the strongest? Covalent's the strongest, ionic's the second strongest, and hydrogen's the weakest. Now in your notes, match each of these bonds, the following molecules, with the correct bond joining their atoms. What'd you get? Here is salt. That is an interaction between two oppositely charged molecules. That's an ionic bond. Here is ethanol. Ethanol is formed by covalent bonds between these atoms. Those covalent bonds we represent as solid lines in chemical diagrams. Here we see some water. Now, water has interactions between hydrogens and oxygens in the water. So there are hydrogen bonds shown here. But actually, water is also composed of covalent bonds and sometimes ionic bonds. Water is a complex molecule. And water is a super important molecule for the way that life works. Water is a complex molecule. It can form lots of different types of bonds. It can form covalent bonds between hydrogen and oxygen, ionic bonds and play a role in acid-base chemistry, and hydrogen bonds with nucleic acids and proteins. Water is important for life because of a number of important properties it has. It's a solvent, And so polar substances undergo dissociation in water, and so they form solutes, so they dissolve into the water. Also, those hydrogen bonds in water molecules, they absorb lots of heat. And so hydrogen bonds in water act as a temperature buffer. So they keep the temperatures of biological organisms pretty stable under the circumstances. Also on our planet, oceans are composed of lots of water, and oceans help keep the Earth at a stable temperature. This is also why, during climate change, the ocean is warming faster than the rest of the planet. And this is also why the heat that's trapped in the ocean will eventually equalize to the land and start to heat up the entire atmosphere. Water in our bodies helps stabilize our internal body temperature. It also does the same for other organisms. Water also has a property that we call cohesive. It's sticky because it can form hydrogen bonds between itself, between other water molecules. Creates what we call surface tension. You ever fill a glass up to the very top and see that little lip over the top of the glass? That's surface tension of the water molecules sticking to each other. It's also important for life since that cohesiveness allows water to do things like flow up the roots of plants and affects fluid flow in blood vessels. Polarity is a really important concept in molecules and understanding the interaction between different molecules. So, as we said before, polarity is when there is an unequal distribution of charge across a molecule. So in water we have oxygen, which is a very electronegative atom, so it likes to hold on to electrons because it has an almost full electron shell on the outside. And so those electrons tend to congregate near the oxygen end of the molecule. And that means the hydrogen end of the molecule is positively charged. If we look at the shape of a water molecule, we have positive charge at this end, and you can see these electrons are congregated down at the negative end of the molecule. Right, so water is a very polar molecule. It's got an unequal distribution of charge, positive at this end, negative at this end. Methane is a nonpolar molecule. In methane, the carbon is pretty neutral. It likes to both give and receive electrons. And so in this molecule, especially since those hydrogens are equally distributed across it, this is a nonpolar molecule. We can have molecules that like to retain charge, like oxygen, involved in interactions that are nonpolar. So in carbon dioxide, we have oxygens that like to retain the negative charge, but they're equally distributed on opposite sides of the molecule. And so because there is an equal amount of negative pool on either side of this molecule, we have a nonpolar molecule in carbon dioxide. Really, the important things to know are that molecules that have an unequal distribution of charge, positive at one end, negative to the other, are polar, and nonpolar molecules have an equal distribution of charge. And carbon is a molecule that tends to be involved in lots of nonpolar molecules. The important thing about this is that polarity can determine what chemicals mix. So polar molecules mix well with other polar molecules, and water is a polar molecule. Nonpolar molecules mix well with other nonpolar molecules. Right? And so hydrophilic molecules that mix well with water and are polar, they are immersible in water and they dissolve well. Hydrophobic molecules are non-polar and they do not interact well with water, such as these little oil droplets in this little puddle. But in biological systems, those oil droplets are the membranes of cells. And those nonpolar interactions in cells play a really important role in determining what chemicals can mix. So acids and bases also play an important role in biological chemistry. So water is a molecule that can ionize. It can break into a hydrogen with a positive charge and a hydroxide, an ion with a negative charge. Right? So those are two oppositely charged molecules. An acid is a molecule that's capable of donating a hydrogen ion to a solution of water. And a base is a molecule capable of donating a hydroxide ion. And then we measure acidity as pH. pH is the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. We measure pH with this equation, and the brackets in chemistry mean we're measuring the concentration or the amount of something in a given area. But what's important to know about this concentration is not the math, but the fact that it's a negative log, and so things with a lower number actually have a higher concentration of hydrogen and are more acidic. Things with a bigger number, up to 14, have a lower concentration of hydrogen and are more basic. We'll also talk in chemistry about buffers. Buffers are chemicals that are resistant to pH change. So buffers are chemicals that can both give and receive hydrogen ions in order to prevent the changes of hydrogen concentration in a solution. Okay? So they prevent pH changes in a solution. So this last part of the lecture, we're going to talk about carbon and organic molecules. And so most biological molecules are organic, and they're composed primarily of carbon with hydrogens attached to it. So carbon is a molecule that has 4 electrons in the outer shell, and it wants 8. And so carbon forms 4 covalent bonds with other molecules. Carbon is really special, and it always forms these 4 covalent bonds. No more and no less. Anytime you see a carbon, it's forming 4 covalent bonds. Those can be double covalent bonds, so those count as 2 covalent bonds, like this oxygen here, or they can be single covalent bonds, like the bonds to this hydrogen here. But whenever you see a carbon, it's got 4 covalent bonds. Those bonds can be to a lot of different molecules, especially other carbons, and so carbon is capable of forming chains or even rings that make up really complex molecules. Carbon also forms interactions with molecules or parts of molecules that we call functional groups. Functional groups give unique chemical properties to those carbon chain organic molecules. Those functional groups often have oxygen and nitrogen, as well as other of those CHONPS molecules or atoms like phosphorus, right, and sulfur. So those are the things that are going to be involved in lots of functional groups. Those functional groups are going to be sticking off the ends of carbon chains. So hydroxyls, which are an ONH, those are a polar functional group. Methyls, which is a carbon with hydrogens attached to it, it's a non-polar functional group. We also have a number of additional functional groups that involve oxygen. They're also pretty polar, and some of them can participate in important chemistry, like acid-base chemistry. And you don't need to memorize this whole table, but you should be able to recognize these functional groups when they show up in chemical diagrams like this one. This is an amino acid. It is a chain of carbon, shown here, but it's got a number of important functional groups that give this atom its important, or that give this molecule, its important biological properties. Those functional groups are what make these molecules interesting. So one of the things we're going to practice a lot is drawing organic molecules. Not because I want you to draw organic molecules, but I want you to recognize what these parts of the organic molecules are. Importantly, we're going to show pictures of lots of different organic molecules, and we're going to draw them in some specific ways. So we can draw chemical diagrams by writing out the atomic symbol and then drawing bonds between those atoms. Those lines are covalent bonds. And these are atoms represented by the chemical signal. We can draw organic molecules by writing out every single carbon and hydrogen and every other molecule in that, and that looks something like this representation here. So this is adenosine with every carbon and hydrogen drawn out. But there are a lot of carbons and hydrogens. They are the most common elements in organic molecules. And so to make things a little bit easier, we can represent organic molecules like this. This is the exact same molecule as this one over here. This is adenosine as well, except every carbon we've omitted the chemical symbol, so we haven't written carbon, but instead we've drawn carbon as the intersection of two covalent bonds. And so anytime you see the intersection of two covalent bonds where there's not another atom written out, those are all the carbons. And if you look over at those same covalent bonds over on this is that carbon here. Same number of carbons. We've just written them as two covalent bonds. Sometimes we'll have covalent bonds that are bonded to things that are not carbon. So this oxygen here, this is a carbon, a covalent bond between a carbon here and an oxygen here. If it's not carbon, we have to write it out explicitly. The other thing we've omitted in this drawing, right, we've written the carbons as the intersection between those covalent bonds. You've written out all the nitrogens and oxygens because those are not carbon. And then the hydrogens that are bonded to carbon, we've also omitted. Right? So we also know that carbon forms 4 covalent bonds. And so if we only draw 2 covalent bonds here and here, and we know carbon formed 2 covalent bonds, we assume those other 2 covalent bonds are bonds with hydrogen. So there are 2 hydrogens missing at this covalent bond. We want to get lots of practice for this, and so we'll go over it in lecture this week and in the future. Another important concept here is that molecules have 3-dimensional structures. So we can also represent organic molecules showing that 3-dimensional structure, like here. And we'll do this a lot when we talk about the structure of complex molecules like nucleic acids and proteins. Those 3-dimensional shapes have a lot of important properties for complex molecules like proteins when they make up enzymes. One important concept is even though these molecules have the same arrangement of atoms, they're actually mirror images of each other, a property we call enantiomers. Right? And so those enantiomers, even though they have the same composition of atoms, right, they're mirror images almost like your hands. So we have a left hand and a right hand. Right? And even though your hands have the same combination of fingers attached to your palms, they don't fit in the same glove. You can't fit a left-handed molecule in a right-handed glove. We'll talk about enzymes, which work by fitting molecules inside specifically shaped pockets in those protein structures. And enantiomers in the 3-dimensional structure of molecules are really important for those interactions. Can't fit a left hand in a right hand glove. This is a summary of some of the things you'll need to know for this lecture. And here are some effective studying suggestions. You should practice drawing and recognizing those organic molecules, and we'll do that in class, right? Because that's going to help you recognize them when they appear on a test. It's also important to recognize how these structures are made. So here is a question that you should be able to answer. How many carbons are in this molecule on the right? Remember how we can omit those carbons in certain situations. Also, look here to identify the functional groups in this molecule. Which one of these functional groups is an amino functional group?